Chapter 38. In the House Alone. With Chalcedony and the fawn de la Cour, Pertolote ministered to Black Pale. She brought him simples, and nursed the wounds on his neck and shoulder, but his lungs were too deep in the great black body, and his heart was deeper still. While she bound the shivered legs, she said, "He said nothing."
"No, lady, nothing," said Chalcedony. "Or something," she said, "but not so as we'd understand."
And she paused. Pertolote completed the sentence. "Understand what happened to Chanticleer?"
"Aye, nothing of Lord Chanticleer."
This was not the return that Pertolote had expected. Some heroic triumph, maybe, though she had, in fact, prepared herself for failure. She was not convinced that her husband could defeat Worm in his lair. Some sadness, certainly, because she'd imagined 1,000 deaths for the rooster and dreamed them nightly. But sadness can be consoled. She had not anticipated so grieved a creature as Blackpale was, nor such determined self-destruction. She pierced the swelling of his fetlock. The ruptured blood ran out, slow, purple blood, from his beautiful tool for walking. She caressed the leg. She thought, "He is so honorable and so desolated." She thought, "He carries a secret in his breast, but his mouth and his eyes were closed together now. He would not be telling it." She looked at the overheated bustle that Chalcedony was making of herself and had the grace to smile. The hen was embarrassed to feel so pleased under these circumstances. "Something," Pertolote said to her sister. "What was that something that he said?"
"Oh, lady," said Chalcedony, "that the child was mine, that I'm to be her mother. What do you think of that?"
Pertolote returned the question. "What do you think of it, Chalcedony?" The crippled hen sat down and gazed at de la Cour, the child of aristocracy and of the melting eye.
"I say," said Chalcedony, "I don't know. It's an uncommon request, surely, and maybe not fitting for nurses to be mothers. Ah, lady, but I love the child, so therefore I say, deep in secret I hear myself saying," whispered the hen, "and why mayn't Chalcedony have a pretty child of her own? Oh, lady."
Pertolote went to the little hen and hugged her.
"The heart has reasons," said Pertolote. "Sister, I say the same."
Cobb came home with an illicit air about him, but he had always been straightforward. Pertolote was not encouraged. Jasper, the fat hen, greasy in her busy motion and rather pouncing in her questions, saw him slipping to the Liverbrook.
"Well," she shouted, "hail squirrel well met. Glad you're back. What happened then? Everybody fine?"
The squirrel looked smitten by the ambush, unable to answer for himself. He peered past all the animals till he caught sight of his wife. Then he lowered his head and sneaked toward her.
"To the hole, Mrs. Cobb," he snapped.
She said, "It's so good to see you again, Mr. Cobb." He said, "Yes." She pressed her paws to her chest with the same sunny smile that was always reserved for him. "Well," she said, "tell us the news, Mr. Cobb." He said, as though he knew, "It isn't good news." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "What happened?" But the squirrel turned taciturn and barked with a louder irritation, "To the hole, Mrs. Cobb." So then, nothing was learned from him but negatives. Pertolote's spirits slipped a degree. She had kept the crows in Chanticleer's absence, though in Pertolote's throat they were songs. This night, as always, she sang a compline of peace, but she wasn't sure whether to believe it. Hard it was to roost alone at night, harder to think that this condition would last forever, but hardest of all was not to know. Something else took place. How could she shape the future while she remained ignorant of what else? Near the end of Compline, a presence was circling the night sky above her as silently as the owl, but she felt it. When she was finished then, she went to find it. Never, never did Pertolote shrink from knowledge. Sharpshin the hawk sat on a stump. He did not greet her, but perched with his shoulders hunched, his beak hooked, his figure dark and stern. She took her place below him.
"Sharpshin," she said.
"Lady," he answered.
"You came back," she said.
"I did, for the moment."
"But you didn't dive from the sky."
"I didn't."
"Was that because of the snow?"
"I can stoop in any weather, lady."
"Ah," she said. "Yes, you can."
He sat still above a field of infinite snow, volunteering nothing. She felt lonely. She felt somehow judged by the hawk that would not look at her, and this was perhaps unfair, since she knew nothing of events, unkind because she had to ask to discover them. Yet this was the very reason for which he came, to be interrogated. It was his obligation, and she was obliged to ask. She did.
She said, "Please, sir, what happened in the north? Was some good accomplished?"
"Worm is dead," said Sharpshin.
"Oh,
what extraordinary news!" She turned and grinned at him, but, oh, what a deadly way he had of delivering it! Her happiness was not his. He gave it, and he judged it at once, the frowning hawk.
"Dead?" she whispered, wishing some other attitude.
"That," said Sharpshin, "is what the weasel screamed, and the weasel saw."
"John Wesley Weasel was there?"
"The weasel, the warrior. He's everywhere, isn't he?"
"Worm is dead?"
"Dead."
"And how—"
Pertolote hesitated. Everything depended on the next question. Too much for a single answer. Too much of the present and all of their future.
"How is Lord Chanticleer?"
In very waves the hawk's severe opinion came down. He did not answer immediately. In spite of herself, Pertolote looked at him with piteous desire. Well, it was her husband, after all. She saw that he was considering how to speak. Finally, "Living," said the hawk, and that was all. Living. Pertolote caught her breath. Chanticleer had not died. Wasn't that a good thing? A wonder? And shouldn't someone rejoice?
"He's coming back, then," she whispered.
Sharpshin said, "I do not know the mind of the rooster." He blinked, closing a subject. The blink came from the back of his head. "These are the facts. I've communicated them to you," he said. "Now, I have one thing left to do, and then I'll be gone." He spread his wings, and by slow strokes flew midnight to the north. He left her by the stump in a snowfield. But there were so many questions. What of Mundocani? And where was someone to celebrate her husband's life? His triumph? Worm's death? Wasn't it a good thing that Worm should be dead? A marvelous accomplishment? Lord, the present was so obscure. What would the future be? And why, if Chanticleer was somewhere alive, did she feel so close to tears? That night, Pertolote paced the beaten snow of the Liverbrook. Wodenstag Mouse woke up with a sharp premonition and with joy.
"He's here," he thought. "The dear rooster's come home again."
He smiled without moving another muscle. He stirred no other brother in the burrow. He allowed delight to flow through his little body a while, and then a warm contentment, and then the warmth alone, and then sleep. All night the pacing above ground encouraged dreams about the golden rooster. But by the morning Wodenstag had forgotten his dreams. Therefore, when he crept across the snow to the hemlock, he couldn't understand why the plain whiteness disappointed him so deeply. Yet he wanted to cry. And when he saw Pertolote alone on her branch, that loneliness seemed a greater grief than yesterday. Why? He felt so bad, but he didn't know why. Then Pertolote saw him, and they looked at one another in a sort of privacy. The hen and the mouse, each one knowing that the other knew so little. They shrugged together. Then they gave each other silly smiles, grateful each that someone saw the sadness and didn't ask the reasons, since they had none. With their looking alone, they said, "I'll watch over you. Will you watch over me?" And both of them smiled again, and that meant yes and thank you, both. How good to have a friend. How necessary. The day to come was not a kind one. The goats came home. The goats stamped into the camp, heedless of the various rules or proprieties of other breeds, heedless of the quiet. The goats came shaking the snow from their coats and braying a list of their misfortunes. The goats permitted some swagger and some allowances because of their adventure, or else perhaps because of their misfortunes, who knows? What are the sources of pomposity? How does a demanding spirit justify itself? Or does that even matter? The goats came. They were tired. Mark how tired they were. They were cold. They were bound to announce, less than pleased with the whole trip, from which they had received one lousy moment of excitement and diarrhea. They drilled the snow with brown holes to prove the latter claim and cried out, "See, see," each time they did. And they were hungry. Breakfast. Where was their breakfast? Well, that was the job of the brothers Mice, who took their duties seriously. So Wodenstag and his brothers brought roots for the goats. Exactly 2 goats ate all the roots, snatching them straight from the mice with their blocks of teeth and no thanks out of their mouths. The other goats, however, filled their mouths with speeches about selfishness and demanded their breakfasts at once, since they had done no less than those 2 and were probably twice as hungry. It bothered Wodenstag to bring more food than was absolutely necessary, seeing the emptiness growing in the bins, but he did. The brothers brought roots again, garnished with a little leaf. They arranged the foodstuffs prettily for the returned adventurers. And then they were mortified by what the goats did. They stomped on the food. They kicked it through the air. They ground it underneath the snow, and they urinated on it. On food. Food! Wodenstag said, "I thought you were hungry." "You thought that because we told you that," said the goats. "We said hungry," said the goats. "Hungry! Hungry! So what did you get us?" "Your breakfast," said Wodenstag. "An insult," brayed the goats. "You insult us with these tiny piles of food. What do you think we are? You think we are as low as mice? Hungry! The tribes of Hophni and Phineas need substances for their guts. But this? We loathe your worthless food." Poor Wodenstag tried to explain. "But everybody eats the same." "Hey, hey, do you think we're everybody?" brayed the goats. "Oh no, you're goats, to be sure." "Then bring us eatings fit for goats." "Which is?" "Lots!" they roared. "Lots and lots! Hungry!" Well, that was more than Wodenstag could handle, but he couldn't just give away food according to beasts' requests, or no one would be eating soon. Well, and he thought that the goats could be dangerous, so then he was frightened too. He went to Pertolote, and his brothers followed in quick scamper over the crusty snow. "It's not your job, I know," Wodenstag began, apologetic over his inability. But his brothers had no such apology. They were simply outraged by the goats' behavior, and they said so in squeaking tumult. "Hungry!" They mimicked the goats with distaste. "Hungry! What kind of a way is that to talk?" And then Sam Stag blurted out the most scandalizing thing of all. "They peed on the food!" he squealed, and all the brothers fell silent. What could anyone say about such vulgarity? Nothing. Pertolote sighed. Wodenstag felt a rush of pity for that sigh. It wasn't just a passing problem they'd brought to her, was it? Pertolote said, "Thank you, Tags. I'll see what I can do." Then the hen walked in a certain dignity to the goat's field, where she paused. Wodenstag crept up behind her and saw what she was seeing. It was simply amazing how fast goats could befoul a place. There wasn't a patch of smooth snow left, not a place to lie down in cleanliness. He heard Pertolote sigh one more time. Then he himself shrank from the command and the anger that flashed from her. "Stand still!" she cried. "Don't move!" she cried. Goats blinked their slotted eyes at this sudden appearing, and for the moment stood still. Pertolote, glaring at them, dug beneath a yellow snow with unconcealed disgust. She pulled out a root both damp and salty, and then, like a vulture clutching carrion, she took to her wings and flew at the most outspoken goat. Suddenly she dived for his mouth. She jammed the root into it. She stung his nose with her nails so that he sucked the root inward, and she cried, "Chew!" One or two other goats began to leer at this fellow's discomfiture, but she flew over these with her nails for their snouts as well, and the hard command, "Shut up!" They did. She was suddenly an iron lady. "Chew it," she repeated to the first goat. "You'll eat what you get. Do you hear? And if you don't like it seasoned, don't season it." The goat lowered his head as if to spit the stuff. Straightway Pertolote bolted for his neck and gripped him there in a very strong claw and hissed, "Lord Chanticleer has 2 weapons, sir. If you spit 1/2 that root, Gaff will cut you here." She drew a line from his ear to his shoulder. His head came up with that line. "If you spit the other half," she hissed, "the slasher will cut you here." She stabbed his jugular. The goat ate the root. To them all she said, "Surely you don't wish me to give Lord Chanticleer a bad report of you, do you? Surely you will live according to his rules till he comes back, won't you?" "Well," muttered the goats. It sounded like "wow." "Well, if he can slash a stag, then he can slash us too. If he can kill a baby, he'd kill anyone." Their manner of acquiescence, it sounded like snot and was meant to sting. It did. Wodenstag saw Pertolote go rigid. Stiffly, silently, by an amazing self-possession, the hen stalked from the goat's field and into the woods. The brothers mice came quietly behind, and so they walked some 50 yards, white snow piled at the trunks of trees, each twig its line of white. All at once she whirled around and she cried, "I know what he means, slash a stag. I saw that. I don't understand it. I saw it. But what does he mean by kill a baby?" She glared at them. Wodenstag only bowed his head. He had no answer. They both knew that. "Lady, thank you," said Wodenstag, "for having a talk with the goats." The expression in Pertolote's face relaxed. "I hate this," she said to Wodenstag, but there was the ghost of a smile on her woman's beak. "Did you see what I did? I threatened them. I made them eat." She shook her head and waved her wing and smiled. "I hate this." But that was the last moment of smiling that day. Wodenstag watched her do marvelous things for returning animals, all the while suffering her own private torment. In the afternoon, a flock of sheep arrived, nearly dead from exposure and exhaustion. Pertolote went out to meet them because she'd seen a hawk circling in the distant sky and knew it for a sign. At her coming, the hawk departed without a word of farewell. Pertolote sighed. Her heart broke for the sheep, though it wasn't only their condition that troubled her. It was their abject debasement. They showed no will whatever of their own. She walked, and they walked. She stopped, even on a whim, and the whole flock stopped without a question, stopped, and would have waited there until they dropped. It was as though they had no mind any more, or else believed that they deserved no choices, as though they should live in perpetual punishment. They would not so much as bleat to be whipped. So what had they done? What had they been led to? What were they not speaking of? Dear God, what caused this killing of the soul? "Gentian," Pertolote said to the mice when she had brought the flock near unto the hemlock, and with a yearning heart she said, "The herb will ease their insides, Tags. Go get them gentian." She noticed Woden's stag gazing at her before he left. He had a dear, sympathetic eye. He said, "The rooster can't be far behind, lady." She released a sigh so sudden and deep that it surprised herself. "Oh, Woden stag," she said. Cats despised the snow. They shook it constantly from their fur, for when it melted it made them wet, but everywhere was snow. They couldn't put a paw down except that it touched snow. They couldn't raise their faces except the snow flew into them. Cats returned in a villainous mood, breathing curses on any who thought to find pleasure in the snow, on hens and sparrows and mice, and any who'd merely accommodated themselves to the snow, on gladness and laughter and joy, on the partridge because she was clumsy. Nor did they wait to see the effect of their curses. It didn't matter. It wasn't vengeance, but a pure vexation of spirit. They held the world in derision, and any who trusted in the goodness of the world they judged to be naive. Nor did they come like the goats in a herd. Rather, they rambled singly through the camp of animals, so that there was a general deflation of goodwill and universal unease. "We've seen your goodness," they sneered when Pertolote urged on them the kindness of other creatures and asked some kindness in return. "We've seen goodness to its core. It has a maggot in it." String Jack rushed to the hemlock, harassed. "Lady," he panted. "Lady!" He sat up and struggled with the words. More than ever his eyes denied each other. "Seen my sister," he pleaded. "Seen my cousin." But Pertolote had to admit he was the first hare to return. Yep, he chattered, panicked, and then, as though unsurprised, "Well," Pertolote's heart went out to the fretful creature. She said, "Perhaps Lord Chanticleer is with—" "Oh, lady!" String Jack exclaimed as if that were a very uncertain suggestion and probably not to be desired. Then he said, "What'll I do? My kin! My family!" In distraction, he started a little run to the south. He stopped, whirled, and finally darted to the north again. He was gone, and he took a part of her heart with him. Pertolote was being whittled by her ignorance, smaller and smaller to nothing. What? Had Chanticleer defeated Worm? Or what? What? What was she to make of all this? The pronghorn, the trip-spring antelope, came more skittish than ever before. And here was a strange thing. Once the voice of a child had been able to calm them. Now the voice of a child sent them flying in alarm, and they couldn't bear even to be brushed by the flank of another creature. They took no comfort in a hen's clucking. And the night itself, when it descended, seemed a pall upon their heads, but they could not run from the night. Worse than that, a wolf would howl in the distant gloom. They were everywhere menaced and nowhere safe. And Pertolote was helpless. She sang a vespers for hearts she couldn't understand, and then it was the brothers mice who whispered in their hole to one another, "Did you hear? The lady is lonely." Chapter 39. Relic. Chanticleer was alive. Chanticleer the rooster was twice alive and coming home. There was himself, and there were in him the worms. Himself, since every other holy task and every other cause for living had been stripped from him, he had settled on one final purpose, and he gave it his whole attention, and he meant to see it completed, and he called it love. By the most strenuous effort, Chanticleer was bringing the skull of Mundocani home again. A mean proof. A nasty proof, perhaps, but proof enough that he had indeed descended to the netherworld, and perhaps Pertolote would count it for something. No, it wasn't a nasty proof at all. It was the right and proper thing to do, to give this dog an honorable burial. His head, at least. Oh, how Chanticleer loved the dog. How precious, then, the relic of the dog's life! And if anyone wanted to measure the length of his love, why, they had only to look at the rooster's exertion, his ruination, his self. Look at his toes, gone swollen, both purple and black. They were frostbitten and likely gangrenous. There was no feeling left in them. And the snow, the everlasting snow piled up against the skull to push back when the rooster pushed forward. Snow clouted the skull's mouth. Snow extruded from its sockets. Snow fouled his good offices and wore him down to death. But the harder the going became, the more certain was the rooster that he would get that skull to home, and show that skull to praiseworthy effect, and finally bury that skull as it ought to be buried. Having nothing else in all the world, the rooster spent himself on this one thing only. And so long as it consumed him, so long as he could with passion curse the snow and the trouble it took to drag a skull, so long as he truly suffered in his person pain in the progress, so long as he delivered all his intellect to the problem of burial, and his expectations to the welcome Mundukani would receive, and his pride to the little glory that might redound to him, then he could not think of the deaths of a coyote and her offspring. Could not, was unable to. No, he could not think of these. He didn't. Himself, Lord Chanticleer the rooster, crossed the snows of the prairies, pushing a bone ahead of himself. He had his token. But the worms. Within him writhed another life, a wriggling in his nasal passages, a multitudinous crawling in his chest, in the muscles of his shoulders, and in his gut. Chanticleer had come up from the cellar of the earth, infested with a congregation of thread-like worms, green when they slid through his mouth, irritating when they twitched in his lungs. They had thriven on worm rot, now they thrived in him. He hated them, even as he hated the deterioration of his being. These things were the same thing, and both were answered by the same expediency: labor, labor, labor hard, and he could ignore their squirming inside of him. Can anyone wonder why, then, Chanticleer became so zealous for a bone, or why he swore so violently whenever it lodged in a drift? He lifted furious eyes to the gray and sifting heavens, convinced that God was against him, and balled his claw, but then he'd whisper devoutly, "No, no, God cannot deny the righteousness of this deed, not this deed, too," and he'd bend himself still more to drive his Mundukani home. But the worms, it was worse than that they simply lived in him like parasites. They seemed as well to sing, and the song was in his ears, in the itching canals of his head, deeper than he could thrust a nail and twist it. They sang at the center of his thought, and what they sang were interpretations, how he might see and understand the behavior of other creatures. This was the more insidious horror, because when was it his thought, and when was it theirs? Several times as he thrashed his way homeward, Chanticleer had looked up to see that he was being watched. Barely visible through the gray curtain of snow stood a wolf, white, the heart of the snow, regarding him. "See," sang the worms, or he thought it was the worms singing, "enemies," and the worms in his heart would squeeze him exactly like the feeling of fright. "You've enemies, cock, and they are watching you." And when he was fool enough to listen to them, he'd groan, "No," out loud, like talking to himself. "You were born in hell. No, you don't know the truth. You don't know my animals." "Oh," sang the worms with perfect assurance. "Look at their faces, cock. See if there's any love in them. See if they don't slit their eyes, conceiving evil against you." "They are good," the rooster would bellow, sound to drown out thinking. "They are treacherous." "I don't believe it." "But you are the best of them, and aren't you treacherous?" "I will not believe it." "You will, you will. Sing, sang the worms,
for a lord betrayed.
When, in that first night, the rooster had spied the white wolf on a ridge above him, the worms had gone so hectic and his denial so savage that it came to choking. They wadded in his lungs like tension, hissing,
watching you with all his spite.
And he had opposed them by beating on his own chest. And then he coughed a ripping, explosive cough and expelled a fist of worms into the snow. This was the first time he had seen them alive, waving their tendril heads. In a rage he attacked them, dividing them with a fierce dexterity, piercing them singly, slaughtering by tiny bites each worm at the midsection, loathing the soft pulp of their skins, and feeling, when he was done, one moment of grateful relief, as though the vomiting were good. But
sing,
the song still troubled his mind.
Sing, for the rooster observed.
And he had looked, and the wolf still stood on the ridge, observing. But he repulsed the thought and returned to the dog's skull, reminding himself of its significance, and he wore himself to death dragging it, and then he did not listen to the vile voice inside. It worked, labor and labor and labor hard, and he could, by God, be deaf to insinuations. He could be good. Can anyone wonder still why a lord would be obsessed by a relic, a dead thing? In the night before he came to the hemlock, Chanticleer raised his voice and crowed to the vacant skies and to the dead. "Worm!" he crowed, "I will not do your evil. As long as I love the dog and serve his honor, I cannot do your evil." He said, do your evil. He might as well have said, if he were speaking the deeper truth, be. That night he trudged the last night home, so wearily. Chapter 40. Beside the nest, and pity in their breast. So it was first of all Woden Stag Mouse who crept out of the hole and across the snow like a thief. Next Donner Stag Mouse, then one after the other, Sontag, Montag, Dienstag, Freytag, and last of all, the youngest of all, Sam Stag. Not that Pertolote recognized each tiny face. It was midnight. They looked like nothing so much as purposeful hairballs, but she'd known Woden Stag by his manner and had counted the rest. Besides, the thieves were gathering at the root of her hemlock, and as their numbers grew, so did the noises of one telling another to shut up. Mice and a midnight raid. Pertolote had nearly tucked her head beneath her wing again, when a change in the noises drew her attention, and a curious activity held it. No, it was a very daring activity, for mice. While 6 stood semicircle, staring straight up with their noses, their mouths hanging open, the 7th mouse had begun to climb a tree. He had all 4 legs extended, as wide as they would go, like a daddy-long-legs on the wall. Each paw had its little nip of bark, and he was trembling so furiously that he looked like a plucked rubber band. But his expression was earnest, and somewhere inside of him was the conviction that he could climb a tree. And somewhere, too, the notion that he should climb a tree. Pertolote forgot, for the moment, the torments of the day in watching this tiny test of fortitude. "Well, can you do it, Woden Stag?" The brothers whispered upward,
"Are you going to fall? Should we get out of the way?"
But grand efforts are always performed in solitude. Woden Stag answered them nothing. When he did, stuck to the trunk of the tree, he trembled. His chin drummed the bark like a woodpecker, and lo! His eye lit up. It must have been the chin drumming that imparted him a flash of insight, because he called suddenly, "Bite the bark!" And Pertolote felt a little cheer in her throat. "Bite the bark! There's the ticket!" Woden Stag bit the bark. So then he could let go successive paws to move them higher up. And what is that if it is not climbing? Why, it's climbing of the finest sort. Pertolote wasn't tired. She was enjoying a miniature triumph. Bite the bark. What a breakthrough. So then up the tree trunk, one by one, with instructions from Wodenstag on a branch above, and encouragement from brothers on the snow below, a constant buzzing of grunts and information, mice climbed the tree. A string of thieves up a tree, and how they patted Sam Stag, and how they praised that youngest brother when he had gained the branch with them, how they congratulated one another all around, and then they turned in unison to look down the branch itself, and the hen at the end of it. So that stilled their jubilations.
"She's probably sleeping," they said in dreadful quiet. "So much the better," said Wodenstag. "She needs to sleep."
Pertolote experienced a true softening in her breast, and her head inclined for gladness. Why, the tags were thinking of her. So Wodenstag came balancing along the branch, picking his inches with monumental care. And after him, frowning severely, Donnerstag and Sontag, and so forth, all staring at the wood in front of them, as if the staring itself were gripping. And then this is what they did. They lined up next to Pertolote, side by side, sitting on 2 legs. Aye, there was the peril, 2 legs. And facing south, the same as she. And then they were done. This was it. This is what they came for. As solemnly as worship they sat still. Rather, they tried to sit still. In fact, they had all begun independently of one another to rock, forward and backward, in an effort to keep their balances, like round-bottom pepper shakers. Too far forward, whoa! Too far backwards, whoa, whoa! But all done with the greatest solemnity, and an air that it was right to be there, no other place to be, amen. Pertolote the hen, for whom they had come, she could only shake her head. There was a pressure in her heart that might have been laughter or might have been tears, either one.
"Tags," said Pertolote. Lady, we didn't mean to wake you up," whispered Wodenstag, as though she were still sleeping. He began to pat her side. "But here you are," she said.
"Yes," he said, simply because it was the fact.
"All of us."
"What a remarkable thing for you to do."
"It isn't easy to climb a tree," said Wodenstag.
"Whoa!" said Montag, and Sontag said, "Whoa!" spinning his forepaws like whirligigs.
"But it's night," said Pertolote.
"Yes," said Wodenstag, patting her,
"and a very dark night, too, I think."
"Aren't you going back to sleep?"
"Whoa!"
said Dienstag.
"Whoa!" "Maybe we could sleep right here," said Wodenstag. "We thought that this would be a very good spot for sleep."
"Whoa, whoa!" It was Freytag who tipped too far backward, too far altogether. Up shot his hind legs, and down went the whole mouse, plump, into a snowbank. Pertolote seemed the only one to notice his departure. I don't suppose," she said, "that it's easy for a mouse to sit this way."
"Roosting,"
Wodenstag explained. Sam Stag went over head first, whoa, and plopped into the snow.
"We talked it over," said Wodenstag. "We agreed that this would be an excellent way to sleep sometimes."
Donnerstag dropped. Freytag had begun to climb the tree trunk again, whispering, "Bite the bark." "Whoa, whoa!" said Montag and Sontag together. They had locked arms. Wodenstag himself still patted Pertolote. Sometimes he clung to one little feather, but then he patted her again. "Why, Wodenstag," said Pertolote, "could you tell me why you decided all these things?" Sam Stag was on his way up the trunk again, and Freytag on his way out the branch. "Yes," said Wodenstag. "Whoa!" roared Montag and Sontag together. Together they hit the snow. Wodenstag kept his earnest composure.
"To keep the dear lady company," he said. "She's got no easy day of it, and at night she's lonely. Don't we know that? So we said, whoa!"
Wodenstag's turn. He flew out to emptiness. but he caught a feather and so was left dangling from her breast.
So, said Wodenstag, gazing down at the ground, we said, let's keep her company. We have us, but she has no one special just now. We thought we could give her a little bit of us, and since she can't fit in the hole, we came to roost.
Pertolote sobbed. It was both tears and laughter in her heart. She sobbed through an absolutely dazzling grin. And the sob felt good, but did no good for Wodenstag, who lost his grip and punctured the snow beside his brothers.
The carefulest, kindest friends I know, sighed Pertolote. So special to me indeed.
She spread her wings and sank to the snow herself. Instantly all the ascending mice became descending mice, and Pertolote purely laughed.
Don't you think, she said, that you could sleep on the ground tonight, if I sat with you? Oh, lady, cried Wodenstag, what a fine idea! Well, and what if you nestled beneath my wings? What about that?
Little Samstag couldn't stand it. He began to laugh at the top of his lungs because his gladness was so great. And Freytag said,
just like the old days!
And Pertolote whispered the nearly unspeakable profundity of Freytag's words. Just like the old days, she sighed. Then under her wings, 7 separate paws took to patting the down of her heart and her love, and she was not alone. Wodenstag popped out with an afterthought.
Don't feel bad you sobbed and I fell, he told her. It's okay if you cry.
It was okay. She did cry. Pertolote bowed her head that night and wept the blessed tears of consolation.